Welcome everyone to the May 2023 integration down under. We've had a couple of false starts this month, but we are finally there. So we'll go through the couple of slides quick. We've basically got our organizers, Martin in Perth, Dan in Brisbane, Mick in Sydney, Wagner in Auckland, and myself in Melbourne. And tonight we have Mick Badran talking about discovering the new customer identity and access management, CIAM. So without any further ado, we will turn it over to Mick. And let me add his and remove mine. There we go.
Beautiful.
And welcome, Mick.
Thanks, Bill. Lovely to be here. And thanks, Dan. Good to be in great company once again. And I'm glad, so happy that I was able to get this one away. Now, the fascinating thing is what I'd like to talk about today or this evening is, there we go, just having a look at some integration. And so I'd like to talk about tokens and how we use tokens within our solutions, and just some of the things that we can do with them to make things a little bit easier and possibly solve that piece of the puzzle that you might solve other ways just by knowing that the capabilities of these tokens. Now, the interesting thing, the reason why I've set it up as part one here is because Microsoft are about to make some big announcements literally overnight and in the next couple of days. So part one is going to be dealing with why we do what we do. And part two will be leveraging those big announcements. And I'll show you, a lot more code, and I'll show you a lot more of how we set things up. And you'll be surprised at kind of how easy it all is now. And that how adaptable it is, particularly in the world, when we're dealing with security, there's so many different ways that we can slice and dice this. But really, as we start to develop our solutions, you want something tried and tested behind you, and you want, literally, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. And what sort of risk footprint do you want as well? Do you want a solution being worked on as a commercial solution by many security engineers and so on and so forth, or are you going to keep rolling your own? So these are just some trade-offs that you might need to make along the way. And what I do want to do is pull back the covers and show you just what it's like working with tokens. And so for that, in terms of the agenda, I want to sort of talk about, securing our solutions and what sort of approaches do we have around that, and then what does a typical solution these days look like, and how much of that solution do we have access to? So in the world of integration where we've been previously, it's maybe we've just got a very thin slice of an overall solution. Or maybe we have a little bit more and some real-time APIs and some third-party services we're calling. And maybe it's a bit further than that, not so much end-to-end, but we along with our integration platform, we might want to adopt a certain security policy or a certain security vision. And particularly, these days where MFA, multi-factor authentication, is the norm and commonplace, you would have seen it with a lot of your, personal apps and things like that you use these days. Are all saying, hey, secure your account, add your phone number in, add something else in, so that we can have at least two ways to authenticate you as you're coming into our solution. So that's the norm. That's a given. So hopefully, if you've got your solutions out there and you're building your systems, you're not having to write an SMS service that's sending these messages out and handling things like invite codes and various other things, because that should just be like a username and password, and you're authenticated or you're not. So there are solutions out there, and let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's use them intelligently. So if we're looking at our typical solutions, then what kind of security options do we have? And I've just talking about these, just as points of discussion, really. And then we start to look at things like tokens, and what do you might have heard of tokens. You may have heard of people talking about tokens and this and that. Let's just pull back the covers a little bit on these tokens and see what we can do with it, and then revisit our typical solution, which is now secured by tokens, and what does that look like. So I want to highlight and show you just some different scenarios here in terms of what we might do. So just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I've spent the last maybe 2 years in this space and solving real world problems around a solution that we've bought, that I've been building, and now being used by various customers all around the place. So just to give you a bit of an idea where all this comes from, it's not, these are just I guess, my thoughts and my experiences and my learnings. As with anything that you go through and that you're taking on board, always be inquisitive, always be asking, always be, well, why are you doing it that way? Is there a better way to do it? And what about this and that? So, some really robust discussions and debates is always healthy. So don't ever accept anything that's on face value from anyone standing in front of you. So when we have a look at securing your solution or securing our solution, what sort of questions, what sort of things does it have in it? Does it have apps? And so, apps is a very general term, and depending where you work and what your exposure is, it could be mobile, it could be desktop, it could be, with sort of, for example, Maui, it could be all those all at once. And so when we're dealing with our apps, do we have just one app? Are there multiple apps? And do I need to, no one wants to have several sets of credentials across the different applications. They want to just be able to have one. And previously we used to call that sort of thing single sign-on. These days it just tends to be, logins. And so, if you've got applications, what about your users? Do you have users? Are you managing those users and maintaining them? So things like forgotten passwords and resets, and there's a variety of different services out there that start at, let's say, the base level, and you can pretty much roll all your services around that. So the base level might be supply an email address and a password, and we'll tell you whether you're authenticated or not, and a success or fail gets returned. So that's kind of the base level. As you progress through the different services out there, then things like multi-factor authentication. I've forgotten my password. I'm going to notify hierarchical relationships between your user accounts, and maybe there's groups involved and things like that as well, that you belong to. The sales assistance groups, and you belong to the reception group, and so on. So there's a few different things that these environments provide. So then we move on to, if you like, our modern day solutions, and we've got APIs, and maybe you've got API management in front of that. How are we securing those APIs? And maybe we have layers of APIs. So these days it's quite common to, invoke a service that has APIs that sit in front of it, or maybe your solutions have several sets of APIs where we tend to have a core set of APIs that govern the back end, and they're tested a lot more than the rest of the system, and they sort of provide the core transactional engine. And then maybe there's other APIs that sit just below your applications that service your application. So maybe you've got a website and a portal, and you've got a set of APIs which service just that, and there's almost an API per screen on that particular application. Or maybe it's a mobile app that has the same type of relationship. As a side note, those particular APIs we call either experience APIs or backend for front end APIs, which is just to give you some terminology. So how do we secure those? And what does that mean? So, loosely speaking, security could be, yes, whoever the caller is to that API, we need to know about, we need to verify and validate. But what about the API itself? So what about the API itself calling maybe your backend system, maybe your database? How do you know that that API is the correct API or has the level of privilege that it needs to be able to do that operation? So if you take, let's say, some front end for let's say some front end APIs, maybe they're read only. Maybe those APIs can just see a handful of things or perform a handful of operations, a subset of operations on what the greater core APIs provide or the transactional APIs provide. And so, how do we control that, and how do we manage that sort of thing? So these are just some questions around, what about if someone else pops up some APIs that calls my back end? How do I secure that? And how do I not allow that? And there's a variety of different ways to do it. But, we hear about APIs being hijacked and various other things as well. How do we set ourselves up right at the very beginning to protect ourselves and give us the best, put your best foot forward, so to speak? And then, in terms of our ecosystem, microservices, third parties and back-end services and the like, how do we sort of maintain that? And then, what is the best solution across this landscape? Is it a mixture of various security policies, if you like, and frameworks and things like this? How can we set ourselves up to give us the most flexibility? So if we have a look at just a typical system here, and I'll explain from left to right. So this is pretty much what I've been talking about. So over on the left-hand side, we have a web page, and that particular web page, where are we? Just up in here. I'll go for my pen. So we've got our web page just up in there. So there's a client, there's a website, etc. And what we would like to do here is to secure that particular website and call into, in this case, it's API management, APIM. And from there, we've got some backend for front end APIs. Pretty much, as I mentioned there in the box, screen by screen. So that really supports this API here is really supporting this client, this whatever that particular application is. So pretty much screen by screen, and it's really built hand in hand. So it's, if you imagine that being a mobile app, for example, it's really, the APIs are really containing all the business logic on a screen by screen basis. And same for this website. And I know we can put code each and, in so many different places and put functionality in places where your strengths are. What this allows us to do is get the richness of back-end processing of, let's say, cloud-based, resources and things, while keeping things like the business logic and keeping the development of in the application UI UX space just contained very much on the user experience and flows. And, we might have other APIs as well, other, back-end for front-end APIs and so forth that are servicing other types of applications as well. And, obviously they would all go through API management in good practice. I just didn't draw all the arrows in there. And then we have, as we move along a bit further, we have things like some back-end APIs, and I call those core functionality. So they exist. They've been born from the very beginning, and they're tested a lot more. They're a lot more robust. If you think about things like banking institutions and financial institutions and things, they're really the APIs that they're on a different version time frame. They're tested more rigorously, and everything else relies on them. So they're very much the core and kernel of the whatever that institution is. So there is there can be various groups of APIs, if you like, and what that does, it allows us to kind of share the most of the functionality that we want across the different applications and different initiatives. So sometimes you get different business units, different groups, or even just different teams. Simply doesn't have to be a massive organization to take advantage of this. But if you think about, one of the focal points is time to market on these in the application space, and how can we make it as easy as possible for whoever, for our team, for our group, developing the mobile app or developing the desktop app of a website. How can we make it as easy as possible for them to get that up and running? And that is by taking a lot of the load that doesn't necessarily need to be in the UX UI space and dropping it into somewhere else that's more akin and more appropriate to running the back end functionality or the business functionality and things like that. So if I'm going to generate 1 million prime numbers, I'm going to generate it in a cloud environment where I can scale to what I need versus JavaScript in a front end browser. So there's sort of just some rough rules of thumb, if you like. So then, maybe elsewhere in this solution or this landscape, you've got various sensors down in here, devices, etc., that capture a whole bunch of readings, and they might send it through to, essentially doesn't need to be, IoT per se devices, but you've got something happening at a very rapid amount of time, and you'd like to send that through. You'd also not like to worry about scale, because a lot of these services here handle scale. So I always say we build for the one but plan for the millions. And so if I'm using these services such as this is Azure IoT Hub, I know that if I've got one device or 40,000 devices concurrently running, that's one piece of the puzzle I don't need to go back and revisit with the question mark of scale around it. Because once you hit scale, there's a lot of shuffling. There's a lot of, potentially database indexes that you need to move, petitioning. There's a variety of different things that we all need to do to keep our system performant. Some of them just crash and scream they go up in flames. Whereas what we want to do is make it as easy as possible on ourselves. And then, we may have some various serverless functions or whatever in the mix as well, and they process the readings. And this might just be a typical system. So throwing in some different bits and pieces in there. I haven't mentioned things like events or notifications or anything else. So how do we sort of secure across this thing? And so what I thought I'd do was just kind of talk a little bit about what this is, and then go through a few bits and pieces around tokens and so on in this space. So we've got our applications, and typically security across the applications, and I've just got some question marks in there from SAML, Firebase, OAuth you may have heard of, and then question marks as in what do you use? And if you don't know, then that's a great question to ask, and start to learn and find out. And then there's other angles here, which is, well, what about if my code doesn't have a user interface on it and it's not really user focused? So there's a lot of code out there, and particularly in the integration world, where we don't need users and we don't interact with users. It's very much system to system, system to process, third party to third party, whatever that might be. So in the application space, we previously had what was commonplace was XAML, XAML type authentication, XAML, what we call tokens. I thought I'd throw something in there which was quite common, or it was quite common for me. Previously, things like Firebase, which was, a very sort of entry-level service where if you're bringing out, a social app, a community app. It's a handy way that works with you, and that you can have a reasonably good authentication mechanism for that particular application you're building. Does it provide all the bells and whistles? The beauty around it is that you do have ultimate control, and that you can build all this other stuff around it the way that you want to. And that used to be all the go, in my experience, a few years back. And then people were saying, well, why am I spending out of a 3-month project? Why am I spending 3 weeks building a password reset where, we don't want, it's already built. It's not going to add value onto your business or onto your solution, really. So you'd prefer to be spending those 3 weeks actually doing business functionality. And then, some other bits and pieces. So OAuth came out, and certainly 2.0, and we'll talk more about that later on. The big difference with XAML is that to use that authentication mechanism, I do need an interactive style login. So if I've got a service or a process, let's say something wakes up once a day and processes a batch of transactions and then goes back to sleep, you're not going to be having the work experience kid going and logging in at 9 a.m. in the morning every morning and get the token and then be able to run the particular process. It's not going to work. So XAML is very much around, a user UI, user experience, when there's a user layer in there. And, I guess it was a precursor for a lot of, the modern authentication mechanisms that we see today. So things like OAuth operates very similar, but also is, if you like, version 2, and sort of allows us a lot more flexibility. And then, obviously there's other things that shouldn't be dismissed or shouldn't be acknowledged, and things like VPNs, of course, firewalls, of course, and things like IP whitelisting. We want to do as much as we can to secure down our applications and our solutions. Things like IP whitelisting get to be a little bit more challenging these days, particularly with cloud-based solutions, where any of these requests coming from your services within the cloud can come from a multitude of source IP addresses. And so, previously we just had one IP address that all these requests would come from. And so, particularly with cloud-based solutions, it becomes a little bit challenging, where we do need to, if that is the case, so maybe you're talking to a service where they need a single IP address. They're not going to put in a range, and I've had that happen, quite a lot, particularly recently. And, so you do need to then do something with your cloud solution to whether you've got an outbound proxy or whatever that might be, to basically ensure that those requests come from a single static or repeatable IP address. So these are just, as you can appreciate, these are quite a lot. And, when we're looking at that solution in the previous page, it's not a simple task, and it's not an easy task necessarily, but it's one that we do need to plan for. And, in terms of securing our solution and how do we do it and how best do we do it. The good news is that there are a lot of services these days that make it easier for us to achieve this. And that's where everyone's going. How easy is it to do this? So, certainly in the world of Microsoft, their security and identity umbrella is falling under the term Entra, and in Azure Active Directory is now being brought in under Entra, as well as the consumer identity access management, the CIAM stuff, and things like that. So I will talk a lot about that and show some details about that in part 2 of this talk. So hold on to that. So we've spoken a lot about tokens and throwing them around just as terms that we all understand. And so what I thought I'd do is just kind of go back to basics to just highlight a few bits and pieces around this, and just go through a very simple, easy flow on what these tokens look like. And so usually in this case, I've gone with a user initiated flow, as we call it. But usually there's a user that would like to log in and start to use a solution or a system. And so maybe they have a client that they're going to connect to, log into, and then that's going to go and access some sort of resource, some sort of backend server, some sort of server around the place, whatever it is. Excuse me, whatever it is, and we'd like to secure all of this. So the way that we tend to do it is by introducing a third party. So this thing called an authorization or authentication server, but really it's authorization at this point. So it's a server that can partake in this particular flow, and the key is that it's trusted by the parties in this flow, in this particular play that's the choreography that's happening. So very similar to, let's say, your driver's license. You could print a license at home, for example, type it up on Word and say, hi, this is Mick's driver's license, he can drive. And if I then drive around and hand it to anybody, they're not going to trust that driver's license at all because they don't know about it. They've got no way of validating it. It's printed on a printer at home. Are the details correct? Maybe, maybe not. To them, it's worthless. So that's why when your driver's license is issued, it's usually issued, here in Australia by the state, what we call New South Wales Service, and so a state body that issues the licenses. So then when we are forced to, or when we do show the license, it can be validated by this third party that, in this case is our authorization server. So let's have a look and see how this particular flow plays out. And so, typically there's some sort of username and password, or, these days it can be quite varied, but let's just stick with username and password. And then from the client, it doesn't know whether that's correct or not, nor should it. And so it'll send that request off to the authorization server and essentially say, hey, I've got this username and password. And what if all things go well, what comes back is what we call a token. And really it's a set of bytes, and it's a particular message. Now, these tokens can be in different flavors and they can be in different formats. The most common one that you would have that we tend to see these days is a JOT-based token, a JWT, which is a JSON token, and we can see some JSON elements and various other things. So this token is quite interesting because inside this token, it tells us that it's been issued by this particular authorization server. And there's a lot of other details in this token as well. Maybe the groups I belong to, or who this user is, maybe the email address of the user, and variety of other details in here. The language that they use in this domain is something called claims, so that your token has a series of information in here, header information, but it also has things like claims, and claims are really a name value property bag, for simplistically. So there's name values that I can put into this token. And you might think, well, as an application or a solution developer, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to enhance or enrich this particular token or this process with some of my own data? Why don't I just let it keep on in this token? And the reason is that this token also is secure. and the token also is signed, so that these days, to the best of our efforts, if a byte changes in these tokens, if anything gets manipulated in the token and tried to be presented, it'll invalidate the signature. So what it does is give us, if you like, a driver's license with a whole bunch of additional information on it that we could actually put in from our system or from elsewhere. So if you think about all that information right now has come from this domain over here, where the authorization server is. So for example, groups. So maybe there's a set of groups that I belong to, and that's in the token as well. Now, who maintains those groups? Who maintains the membership? Someone dealing with the authorization server over here and whatever this domain is. So, there's pros and cons, and this is, previously it's been a very secure environment, and with not, and it's always been quite treacherous and difficult to work with and intercept and customize and try and get a little bit of control around that authentication process that goes on in that authorization server space. Lo and behold, you'll be pleased to know that it's a lot easier these days. So we end up getting this token back, and obviously now I can present that token to whatever the resource is, whether it be an API, whether it be IoT Hub or whatever. If you think back to our typical solution diagram, and then that resource server has a way to validate and authenticate that particular token. Is it a valid token? Is it from, is it a valid driver's license? Is it from the right, issuing party? Is it from, is it a state New South Wales driver's license or Victorian driver's license? Somehow it's got to be able to do that. And so, in this particular realm, there are connections back to here that I didn't actually put in, but because this is a trusted party between the user and the resource server, then it accepts the token and can actually supply back whatever that access is. So in essence, that's kind of our a lap around our tokens. The other thing to do with these tokens, there's a few different types of tokens. So one is purely around identification. So hey, this is your ID card. This basically asserts who you are. Other tokens are what we call access tokens. So they allow you to try and access maybe Office 365, maybe Power BI, for example, etc. So various resources that are out there. And then these tokens can be one and the same. They can include an ID token, can include access, however they're packed, and they just have different fields in there. If you think about, it's got name value pairs. It's just basically name value pairs. And then there's a variety of other things that we can do with the tokens, but in a simple sense, this is a very simplified way, but a straightforward way, and this is what we do with our tokens. So in terms of some of these tokens, now I've got one here that is a XAML based token. The first thing that you can see here is that it's XML, which, yes, I know it used to be the rage, and we, part of this user group, we spent a lot of time looking at XML, I'm sure. So we've got a variety of different things in here. One is things like the lifetime. So, just because you've got the token doesn't mean you're going to have it for a year and a day. Maybe it's got an hour's life in it. Maybe it's got 24 hours or 3 hours. But if you think about securing the system, it becomes quite important that we do set the appropriate lifetime and we don't have them infinite, for example. So maybe it's half an hour, and some of them, some solutions, third parties that you're using tokens with, they will refresh. So let's say the life in one particular system I'm thinking of, it's a 30-minute lifetime. if I make a call to that system, it'll return me back a refreshed token with a reset lifetime back to 30 minutes. So when I call their APIs, I get a refreshed token. So there's a bit of token management on my side as a client to ensure that I'm using always the most current and up-to-date token. So there's things in here such as applies to. So where is this token applying to, and that's typically the resource or the servers that we want to access. And then we've got things like the details of the token are in here, and so on. So I'll just go to the next one, and we can see the applies to. And so in here, there's an address. It could be multiple addresses, and excuse me. And so, here's a website that, so in other words, if I present this token to somewhere else, it can validate this and say, are the details in this particular token correct? And is the address correct for me? And if it isn't, then it invalidates the token. And you'll be pleased to know that there's a lot of libraries and a lot of NuGet packages that handle a lot of just what I spoke about before. You can just pass the token in and pretty much it'll say valid or invalid for you. And then if we open up this particular token even further and have a look in the requested security token, we have things like an audience, which also refers back to the site or the resource. So, who is the audience for this particular token? And then we've got things like a variety of different attributes, which in a XAML token came out like this, where these are the name value pairs. These are the claims that I sort of mentioned before. And we can add to those in a controlled way. So this is one example of a token and how long it lasts for, and there's some XML. Now you'll note that it's in plain text. Okay, I have gone and massaged it slightly. It's sent over the wire in base 64 encoding as in a header value, typically. And so what I did was just decode that and then just show you this right here. All right, so what I might do is, so before I jump into OAuth, I'm going to show you just how we get to that. All right, so hopefully you can see that. Great. All right, so this is a little bit around what I've been working on. So this is a demo site and what I've been working on the last, as I mentioned, 2 years or so. And so if I hit, what I did was just stop that. So here's it. Awesome. All right. Don't worry about that. Now that, I want to do that. Private browser window. There's a cookie involved here. So I'm just going to, again. There was a step in between that I just wanted to show you. Okay, so I get asked to log in. Now this is using Azure Active Directory, and you'll notice the level of customization that you can see. So we've got things like terms of use. We've got little writing down the bottom, backgrounds, custom text in here, various logos and things like that. So I can also come along and say, well, I'm going to go and create one. And at this point, I think just use that account. I'll go next. So here's a sign up flow. And I'm just going to grab that code from a different window. So it automatically does a code check, and we just sent you a code. Give me a moment. There we go. Oh my word! I'm just being asked to do something else. Oh, I know what it is. Sorry. Previously logged in as. I just wanted to show you a little bit about, how we could use some of these backend services, such as Azure AD, and provide that level of enterprise grade security for not a lot of work at all. Now, I did this. There we go. I did this the old way, if you like, the previous way using B2C, and there's about 60 files. I kid you not, there's about 60 files that I need. The solution was very brittle. So we end up having a whole bunch of different details and things like that I can come and create an account with. I won't do that right now, but I wanted to show you just that particular flow of going through. So if I come through back to here, I do have an account which I'm going to use, and I'll use this particular one here, which, where am I? All right, maybe. I shouldn't have logged out. Always the way. The success of a demo is inversely proportional to the amount of people watching it. Okay, so we end up getting, a login that you're familiar with. It doesn't need to be, a Microsoft account. It could be an external, could be a Gmail, could be, a variety of different places. So I don't want to stay signed in, and I've now logged in. So I've logged in. There's a few different things that we can do in, as part of this. I'm just going to go to F12, bring up the interesting stuff. Let's not worry about this for the moment, that part. Click on the dashboard. And what I'd like to do is to grab the token that we're using, it's in the headers, that we're using. So it's this guy here. So if I go and grab that particular token, and I will drop it into this particular, what I've done is just grab that header value from the request, and the tokens tend to begin with EY, and you'll notice that there's a few different colors in this. So this is just a JOT token explorer, and a lot of you would be familiar with it. It could use jwt.io. It doesn't need to be a Microsoft one. And so you'll notice there's a few different colors in here. So there's things like the header details, and this will all become apparent below when I scroll down in just a moment. The green here is the signature. This sort of invokes the signature and the checksum and things like that. And obviously the blue is the payload of this token. So as I come down here, we can start to see a few different, a few bits and pieces. The type is a JOT token. What sort of signature algorithm did we use? RSA 256. And then there's a few different IDs, key IDs they're called. And so this might be the key that we use. We could go off and use it. And it's very similar to certificates, if you're familiar with certificates. Sometimes the certificate is embedded in the token itself, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes there's a pointer or a reference to the certificate. And obviously that would be a public key, not a private key that you'd see. So there's a variety of different things in here, such as the audience, who that audience is. These are to do with the things like not before. These are timings. So this token is only available between a certain time. It expires in this time if I don't get a new one. And there's a few other details in here that I've put in as configured in the back end. So it's really quite handy. Now, I've also got this thing in here called the date of birth, correlation ID, API version, the name, nurse test. And then in here, I've got something called nurse HT roles, which is some additional information that I also base 64 encoded. So if I take that out and then just come up here and drop that into my decoder, excuse me, you'll see that it is also JSON, and I'll just format that. So it tells me there's some other details in here. Excuse me. And that there's some other things around roles, also number of days. There's a few bits and pieces, and then there's some things about what sort of what styles are available, and what customizations do I want to see things in, and all that's inside a token. So when we go back to this application here for the moment, hello application, where have you gone? Let's just come back to here. So when we go back to the application, in the token, in that particular token, there's details around what the colors of this should be and the various. So this particular app is to do with healthcare, aged care, and so it varies. It's got various devices and remote monitoring and telehealth and things like that. So just to show you what powers some of this. So the fact that information is in the token. So for example, what role do you have? And so I had 2 entries in there, and my role as a nurse or a doctor or a family member or whatnot. All that's contained within the token. And the reason for that is that my membership to, in this particular solution, these facilities, whether it be a hospital or a aged care or a village, now I may or may not be allowed. I need to be invited in. Just because, for example, I'm a nurse doesn't mean I have access to 100 different facilities. Just because I have a login to the system, I need to be invited into each facility by the administrator there to be able to go and work in that particular domain, that particular space. So if you think about, you might say, well, why didn't you do it as part of groups? So that we could log into Azure AD and we could have this as part of groups. And I go, well, we could do, but maybe, there's a lot of group membership and there's a lot of group management that I need to do to maintain, the membership. So at each different facility, they're going to have a doctor's group, they'll have a nurse's group, they'll have a, and on it goes. Whereas my application already knows all of this and the solution knows all of this. So what would be really handy is as we're authenticating, part of that authentication process, can we go away and call into my solution to get back some additional claims and then go and return those back and include them in the outbound token? And that's the exact thing that I'd like to show you next in part 2 in terms of code. But I will show you a little bit of this code. So I've got a function here, which is called enrich token function. And it's written in C#. Don't worry if C# not your language. I just want to really highlight a particular point here where this function is executed as part of the authentication process, and that's configured elsewhere. So inside here, I get things like a correlation ID that gets sent to me, and then I need to make a request. I need to make a request to our solution so that to the backend system so that I can get back some details about that particular request, that user. So there's some details that we go and make a call into a backend solution. And then after that, I go and essentially add the results into that custom roles. And you see that as being HT roles in the token itself. So I just wanted to show you a little bit on that particular JOT token, OAuth style. And so what the token is that we're talking about is, it looks a bit like this. And so, you know, that's this token that we had, and there was the piece below it. So when we, you know, fantastic, we can add some details in, we can add some custom details into our solutions. We can really make these tokens work for us by having all of this additional stuff. The reason, the appeal of this is that the token is signed and secure. So the token has a digital signature on it, which in this case is from Azure AD. So it's a bit like adding more details onto your driver's license and then having those being handed around all the time. So if we have a look at what a token-based system might look like, there's nothing stopping us from building our own token. Okay, so there's nothing stopping you from writing some code that says, here's a token, and here's a snippet of code that does exactly that. So we can add some claims in, and in this case, I add a doctor in as a role. You could have a whole bunch of other things that you want to add in as part of the token, and then we call this, code here that just says write token. So create me a token and return back. So the thing that I haven't included in here is how the signatures get done, and that's a little bit up here in the initializer up here. I need to give it a couple of keys, but I just wanted to highlight the principle of what we do here. So I could, you today or tomorrow, you could go and foot up a server that returns back your tokens. Now, if you hand that somewhere, how are they going to validate it? Two, is it going to be bona fide? Is it going to fit the bill? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But, I wanted to show you, just when we talk about tokens and things, you can go and do this as easy as possible. And then, things like your code themselves, if we look at this top routine here, acquire access token, your code can actually go and create a token for itself. So we have, this code down here that says acquire token. And so, generate me a token. And so here in this result is an access token and a couple of other things, and when the refresh should occur on what I've done. So why would my code want to have a token? Now, the thing about this particular, or the weakness about this particular piece of code here is that I've had to supply some details, a client ID and a secret, which is very similar to a username and a password. If I'm running this in Azure, for example, I can use the managed identity. So I can use what we call the default Azure identity and not have to specify these details. I don't like specifying these details because it's another thing that I've got to manage. But for the moment, our code can also ask for a token. And there's a piece in here which are resource IDs. And this resource ID might be the addresses of the servers that this particular piece of code wants to access, or the addresses of the APIs, or things like scopes and other terminology that we can use inside here. So we can add whatever we want to this token, and then essentially we can say, go and create me, return me back a token for what I asked for. And wherever this service is, in this case, this is Azure AD, and maybe it's our own server, but if it's Azure AD, we've got an extra level of trust and security on that. So what a token-based system looks like. So, as I mentioned, we could roll our own tokens. You could go through commercial providers, which take a lot of headache away, a lot of management away, and give you a really high level of trust. You're also get exposed to the latest and greatest there, so that when we look at multi-factor authentication, it's now moved beyond just a text message you get. Maybe there's an authenticator app that you use. Maybe there's a code that's on the screen that you've got to put into the authenticator app, and then yes, that all works. So how do we, how is identity managed? And then, things like multiple systems and so forth. So there are some standards in identities evolving and emerging. So, users can get ident IDs and things like this. So, does our system handle it? And we'd like to then, go on to things like single sign-on and being able to sign on across a variety of different systems. So in terms of, in sort of just the last, in rounding up here, a typical system now secured by tokens, we're very familiar with things like the user token and being able to get that user token. That's where I showed you. We went into F12, we pulled it out of there. There's some interesting bits and pieces. Now, through my journey through this particular system, I could pass the user token all the way through, so that at any point along the way, if a piece of code needed to check whether I could actually do that, they could look at the token and then also look at some other backend. There's always an independent validation of what's been presented. Don't ever believe what you've been handed in the front door. Now, the other piece that I did want to show you or talk about here briefly is the system token. So this is around, and it's exactly the same. It's a user token, it's a OAuth token, it's a JOT token. It's exactly the same, except the entity that requested this token is some code. So in this particular code, they have a client ID, they have a secret or a username and password. They get back a token, and that token is passed through the back end. Excuse me, along with a user token. So it provides an extra level of detail here and security, where the backend APIs, this operation says who's requesting it. And the request is coming from the backend, from these sets of APIs or this bit of code. Yes, that system token checks out correctly. Yes, that's valid. Excuse me. And so the calls themselves are secure between components on the system. So if you think about microservices architecture and the like, this could be one way that you could secure out these microservices. Am I going to accept a request from you? Yes, because your system token checks out. Or no, it doesn't. It doesn't have the level of permissions, or it's invalid. The piece on top of that then is the user token. Can the person sitting in the browser have access to what they need to have access to? Or can they do the management operation that they need to do? So, it's a slightly different way of what you may have been, maybe used to, but it's certainly food for thought and something to think about. And so now when we look around this lap around tokens, we've got all the different players involved. We've got our username and password that goes through. We've got, there we go. That's what I wanted to do. So the username and password goes through. Now within the authorization server, we can make a request out to my system and say, is there any additional information that you would like to supply? And so typically at this step, the user has already been authenticated. So we know they're valid because we trust the authorization server here, which in this case is Azure AD. And then my system will get this request that's that Azure function that we called a moment ago, and return back some details as part of the authentication flow. And then they get baked into the token and they all get returned. And that's that HT roles and date of birth and correlation ID and things. And then now we have a richer token that we're moving around and passing around through our system. So in conclusion, hope you enjoyed that. It's really quite fascinating when you dig into tokens, just how much flexibility there are and how much you can do in them. From when I started this journey, 2 years ago or thereabouts, it is now a lot easier to put all this stuff into your applications, into your solutions. The libraries are better; they're more compatible with each other. And even though I made reference to C# in this presentation and Azure AD, there are a lot of authentication third parties and companies and providers out there, and and the corresponding libraries that you can use in a multitude of different languages. So I just popped them in there because that was code I had readily available, and also for brevity. All right, so Bill and crew, that is me. Shall I stop sharing?
No, that's all right. Yeah, I'll do that. Or move. I'll add this. So I'll go look and see. I don't think we've got any other questions, but that was really good. I enjoyed that. I've done a little bit with that, even with the enhancement piece of enhancing your tokens as they go through.
Yep.
I think I did mine with the Azure B2B as opposed to B2C.
Yeah. That's the one that I spent. That's what I embarked on, and literally 60 files, and all to do with custom branding and various other things. And,
oh, okay, yeah.
But it's not easy. None of it's easy.
Yeah, we did all the stuff in the code, and
yes,
so we didn't
in the
have
policy.
a lot of those files. Yeah. So,
oh yes.
But I mean, it definitely makes it easier. And the other thing is it gets you away from exposing your password database because somebody took a backup of it and left it out on an S3 file share.
Yes.
So it gets you out of holding that information and stuff for people. And I mean, the thing is that like 6pivot, we've gone to the MFA now prompts you with a number, plus it gives you a location in the application that's requesting that MFA.
Yeah, great. Now is my camera frozen?
Yeah, your camera's frozen. And it's one of those things that you get overload of MFA and you just get all these requests, and if you don't have any other information in them or a number in them. And the interesting one is I was doing some stuff in Azure East US, so I got an MFA request from New York.
yeah.
So it was like, where's that coming from? And then it was the Azure portal. I went, yeah, okay, I'm in doing a bunch of stuff in East US at the moment. So, but that was an interesting thing that a few people noticed with that turning on that MFA stuff. But yeah, it's you get out of having to build all that stuff and things like that, which to me is
that people are just going to keep asking for it. So can you do this? Can you do that? And it's just an area that is a whole speciality onto its own.
And I mean, the thing is that more and more people are having their Office 365 account, so that you can leverage that even across domains and things like that.
Yeah, it's now
you just don't have to worry about somebody creating a logon and password.
Well, you think about all the links and the OneDrive and SharePoint links you're getting, and it's just far beyond sort of a guest in a working group. It's here's a quick file I need to share with you as part of that meeting that you got invited to.
Yep.
So you just really want all that to work.
Yeah, so makes a big difference. So that is very good.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of things that I do want to show in part 2. So maybe.
Yep. I can understand that as they release a few more of the tidbits of this.
I know, and
So,
yeah, they're all at build, so it's a challenge to pin someone down to sort of answer a couple of questions.
Yep, that's thing, and so, and then Dan and I are off to London in a couple of weeks.
Oh, that'll be great.
So that'll be good. So yeah.
Yep, are you doing 2 presentations, Bill?
I'm doing one, and then Martin and I are doing another.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, just similar one that Martin and I did on the integration down under. So yeah, it's it'll be my first time to London, and it'll be my first very long plane trip after COVID.
Oh dear.
So
yes, yeah, no, it's a bit of a slog, that one. Are you going through Hawaii?
No, I'm going Melbourne to Doha, Doha to Heathrow.
Oh yeah.
So it's 14 to Doha, and then another 7 to Heathrow. I mean, I decided to go to. So I'm going to end the broadcast. Thanks everyone for listening.
Yes.